On live television in front of millions, Glenn Youngkin thought he had Jasmine Crockett cornered. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with that familiar condescension, the smug half-smile on his face signaling that he believed he had already won. But then it happened. Crockett, calm and unshaken, delivered a single line that sliced through his entire argument like glass shattering in silence. The crowd gasped. Youngkin's smile faltered. His notes suddenly seemed useless. His hands fidgeted. In that instant, the power dynamic flipped, and the governor, who had built a reputation on controlling the room, found himself struggling to keep his composure. The cameras caught every detail: the tightening jaw, the nervous glance toward the moderator, the sudden dryness in his throat. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words carried a gravity that pressed down on everyone in the chamber. It was the kind of moment where time slows down, where even the air feels heavier. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Social feeds lit up within seconds, clips of the exchange already ricocheting across the internet. This wasn't just another debate. This was a reversal of fortune broadcast in real time. Crockett had done what few dared. She had faced down a governor who thrived on posturing and performance, and with calm precision, she dismantled him. Youngkin had prepared a trap, and yet it was he who was left exposed. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. It was the silence of realization, of a collective recognition that something historic had just happened. But here's the thing. Moments like these don't appear out of thin air. They are forged in years of struggle, sharpened through countless battles, and ignited by the weight of history itself. To understand why Youngkin's argument collapsed so spectacularly, to truly grasp why Crockett's words carried the force of a thunderclap, we need to rewind, because what unfolded on that stage wasn't simply a clash of personalities. It was a collision of values, visions, and the very future of American education. And the story of how the tables turned begins long before the cameras rolled that night. But to understand how this takedown unfolded, we need to rewind to the very beginning. The story begins with the weight of a nation's anxieties pressing down on the stage. Education is not just another policy bullet point. It is the battlefield where America's future is decided. Parents tune in not for entertainment, but because they are desperate. They worry about whether their kids will be prepared for a world more competitive, more diverse, and more unforgiving than the one they inherited. They fear that schools are falling behind, that their children are being left without the tools to thrive. In living rooms across the country, mothers and fathers watch debates like this one with the intensity of people watching a lifeline being tugged across a storm. Glenn Youngkin knows that fear, and he wields it with precision. He steps onto the stage cloaked in the language of traditional values, casting himself as the guardian of an idealized past. His words are carefully chosen to stir nostalgia: simpler times, clearer rules, classrooms free of distractions. He frames his vision as common sense, a return to order, a defense against what he paints as chaos. It sounds comforting, almost soothing to those who feel the ground shifting beneath them. But underneath the polished delivery is a strategy designed to divide, to pit parents against teachers, to strip complexity away until only slogans remain. Jasmine Crockett enters with a different kind of energy. Where Youngkin invokes fear, she invokes possibility. Where he narrows the future, she expands it. Her education plan is rooted in inclusivity and opportunity, not just teaching children how to pass tests, but how to dream bigger, how to navigate a world that refuses to stand still. She reminds the audience that classrooms today are filled with kids from every corner of the world, carrying every accent, every skin tone, every story imaginable. And if education doesn't rise to meet that reality, then America risks dimming the potential of an entire generation. That clash, fear versus possibility, nostalgia versus progress, sets the stage for what follows. It is not simply Crockett against Youngkin. It is two visions for the country locked in combat, with every viewer invited to choose which future they believe in. The stakes aren't abstract. They are written into the lives of children who will either inherit opportunities or inherit barriers. They are felt in the choices parents make every day, whether to trust public schools, whether to demand better, whether to believe that all children, not just some, deserve to thrive. And that is why the room felt electric even before the first question was asked. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange of talking points. It was going to be a clash that spoke to the heart of America's identity. Would the country retreat into fear of change, or would it embrace a future that demanded courage? As the cameras rolled and the first volleys of argument flew, few could have predicted the way the night would end. But one thing was certain: what happened on that stage would not stay in that room. It would ripple outward, through homes, across social media, into classrooms and boardrooms, shaping the national conversation in ways that would be impossible to ignore. What happened next didn't just stay in that room. It shook the entire national conversation. To understand Glenn Youngkin's collapse on that debate stage, you first have to understand the playbook he carried with him, the carefully crafted persona, the polished surface concealing a much sharper edge. He rose to power by mastering a simple formula: present himself as the everyman in a fleece vest, approachable and pragmatic, while quietly fueling the fires of division. To his supporters, he was the tall, smiling businessman who promised order. To his critics, he was the embodiment of a culture war governor, wielding fear as both sword and shield. From the beginning, education was his chosen battlefield. He learned quickly that nothing stirs anxiety like the question of what children are being taught. Parents, overwhelmed by economic uncertainty and rapid cultural change, became the perfect audience for a leader promising to protect their kids. Youngkin leaned in with precision, banning certain books, policing curricula, and framing inclusion as indoctrination. Each move came wrapped in the language of common sense. Who could argue with protecting children? But beneath that language was the real strategy, narrowing the definition of whose children deserved protection. What made him so effective, at least at first, was his ability to perform reasonableness while stoking outrage. In interviews, he could tilt his head, soften his voice, and insist he was just listening to concerned parents. But on stage, in debates, the mask often slipped. There, his condescension emerged. He didn't just disagree with opponents, he lectured them as though they were unruly students in need of discipline. To him, authority wasn't something earned by wisdom, it was something claimed by confidence and repetition. Time and again he deployed the same tactics: simplify the issue until it became a slogan, then hammer it until dissent sounded un-American. Keep politics out of the classroom. Protect our kids. Parents first. On paper, they were clever lines, but in practice, they ignored the very real complexity of classrooms filled with children who didn't fit into his narrow vision. His critics pointed out the contradictions: preaching freedom while silencing teachers, promising inclusion while erasing history, calling for unity while mocking those who disagreed. And yet, for years, this strategy worked. It propelled him into office, gave him headlines, kept him on the short list of rising stars within his party. He had become accustomed to being the most comfortable man in the room, confident that his presence alone could tilt the stage in his favor. Opponents often stumbled under his interruptions, intimidated by his height, his money, his aura of inevitability. But that confidence came with a fatal weakness. He underestimated anyone who didn't play by his script. To Youngkin, a debate was not about truth, but about dominance. Who controlled the clock? Who looked unflappable? Who could sneer and still smile for the cameras? What he never said accounted for was an opponent who could match composure with substance, who could absorb the blows without flinching, and who could strike back not with volume, but with precision. That weakness became glaring when he faced Jasmine Crockett. In his mind, she was just another challenger to swat aside with a few dismissive lines. He believed his slogans were sharp enough to slice through anything she put forward. He thought the polished act, the same act that had carried him this far, would carry him again. But what Youngkin didn't realize was that the very traits that had lifted him up, the arrogance, the smug certainty, the habit of underestimating opponents, were about to betray him. Because when the cameras turned, when the microphones were live, and when the stakes rose higher than ever before, he was no longer the man holding the room. And that's when it became clear. Glenn Youngkin hadn't prepared for an opponent like Jasmine Crockett. He hadn't prepared for a challenger forged not in comfort, but in struggle. He hadn't prepared for someone who carried more than just policy papers onto that stage. Someone who carried lived experience, resilience, and the voices of those he had ignored. But what Youngkin didn't anticipate was facing an opponent who had spent her entire life preparing for this fight. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin on a debate stage, nor in the bright lights of television studios. It begins in the quiet grind of everyday struggle, where dignity was not handed out freely, but had to be demanded, defended, and earned. Raised in a community where opportunity was often rationed, and voices like hers were too often dismissed, she grew up seeing firsthand what happens when children are told they don't belong, when families are shut out of the promise of America. Those memories never left her. They hardened her resolve, shaped her fire, and built the armor she would one day carry into battles far larger than herself. Her path led her to law, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She watched neighbors lose homes, parents fight for fair treatment, students face barriers that wealthier communities never even imagined. In every courtroom she entered, she carried those faces with her, the mothers working double shifts, the kids translating for their parents, the families whose worth was measured unfairly by zip codes. Law wasn't an abstraction for her, it was survival, and she wielded it like a shield for those who had been told they had no defense. But Crockett was more than an attorney. She was an advocate, an amplifier, a disruptor of silence. When she entered politics, it wasn't to collect titles or to decorate a resume. It was to fight from a higher stage for the same people she had been defending for years. Her voice, sharp and unshakable, quickly became known for cutting through noise and exposing hypocrisy. She didn't temper her words to make the powerful comfortable. She spoke as if every sentence carried the weight of those who had entrusted her to represent them. And that authenticity, that refusal to bend under pressure, earned her both respect and attacks. Critics painted her as too bold, too confrontational, too unwilling to play nice. But what they failed to grasp was that Crockett's entire life had been a rehearsal for standing firm when others demanded she step aside. She had seen too much to soften now. Every insult hurled her way only reminded her of the long tradition of voices told to sit down, voices that history later remembered as the ones who dared to stand up. When she spoke about education, it was never abstract policy. It was personal. She carried the faces of children whose futures hinged on whether leaders dared to expand opportunity or chose to shrink it. She remembered being in classrooms where the resources were scarce, where teachers bought supplies out of their own pockets, where potential was dimmed not because kids lacked brilliance, but because the system lacked vision. To her, every education debate was not about budgets or charts. It was about whether America would finally live up to its promise of equal opportunity. That is why, when she walked onto the stage opposite Glenn Youngkin, she did not see a governor with power and prestige. She saw yet another barrier, another polished figure insisting that some children mattered more than others, that nostalgia outweighed progress, that fear was a better teacher than hope. She had seen this play before, in different costumes and different rooms, and she had spent her life preparing for it. Her calm demeanor that night was not an act. It was the product of battles survived and lessons learned the hard way. She didn't need to shout to command attention. Her very presence radiated the strength of someone who had endured storms and refused to be moved. And when she finally leaned forward to deliver her crushing rebuttal, it wasn't just her words that carried weight. It was the story of every child she had defended, every parent she had stood beside, every voice that had been ignored until she refused to let it fade. For Crockett, the debate wasn't just political theater. It was personal history colliding with national destiny. And that history gave her a clarity, a precision, and a resilience that no rehearsed slogan could compete with. And on that night, those battles would converge in one unforgettable exchange. The room was already tense before the first sparks flew, but as the exchange unfolded, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Glenn Youngkin, tall and polished, wasted no time establishing his rhythm. He leaned into the microphone with a rehearsed confidence, his voice rolling out well-worn phrases about protecting children and keeping classrooms free from politics. He interrupted, he over-explained. He spoke with the cadence of a man who believed sheer volume could drown out substance. Each time Crockett began to lay out her ideas, he cut in, shaking his head, waving a hand dismissively, chuckling as though her words were naive, unworthy of serious attention. For a while it looked like he was dictating the tempo, but Crockett was not rattled. She sat poised, eyes steady, letting his interruptions echo into the silence. Where others might have rushed to defend themselves, she waited. Her restraint became a quiet kind of defiance, and it unsettled him. The more he tried to dominate, the clearer it became that he was struggling to maintain control. His voice grew sharper, his smile tighter, the mask of composure slipping with each jab that failed to land. The audience began to sense it too. A murmur rippled through the crowd every time he cut her off, every time his laughter edged into mockery. Viewers at home noticed the imbalance, the image of a governor so determined to belittle his opponent that he revealed more about his own insecurity than her supposed weakness. Slowly, the narrative was shifting. What was meant to look like authority was starting to look like desperation. And through it all, Crockett remained composed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, didn't let frustration leak into her tone. Instead, she let his words pile up like kindling, knowing that at the right moment she would strike a single match and set the whole structure ablaze. The patience, the discipline, the stillness. It was the kind of presence that pulls a room in closer, that makes every listener lean forward in anticipation. By the time the moderator tried to reel Youngkin back, the tension was unbearable. He leaned across his podium, launching one more attempt to box her in with a sweeping dismissal of her education plan, claiming it was unrealistic, impractical, doomed to fail. The words hung in the air, arrogant and absolute, as though the final gavel had been struck. And then, she leaned into the mic with a calm that silenced the room. Her pause was deliberate. For a heartbeat, the room went still. Glenn Youngkin's smirk lingered, as though he believed the silence meant victory. But then Jasmine Crockett spoke, Not with anger, not with fire, but with the steady cadence of someone who knew the weight of truth was on her side. "Governor," she began, her voice calm enough to slice through the tension, "if protecting children means starving schools of resources, silencing teachers, and erasing the stories of half the kids in the classroom, then the only thing you're protecting is your own ego." The chamber erupted in murmurs, a wave of shock rolling through the audience. Youngkin's grin faltered. Crockett didn't wait for him to recover. She pressed forward, each word sharper than the last. "You talk about keeping politics out of classrooms. But Governor, it was you who turned our schools into political battlegrounds. It was you who decided that children learning their own history is a threat. It was you who pushed parents to fear one another instead of working together. And now, you stand here claiming to defend families when all you've done is divide them." A few gasps punctuated her words. The camera cut to Youngkin, his jaw tight, fingers tapping nervously against the podium. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but Crockett raised a hand. Calm, measured, dismissive. The audience applauded at the gesture, the sound swelling like a tide he could no longer control. "Education," she continued, her tone lifting now with conviction, "is not about shielding children from the truth. It is about equipping them with the tools to shape their future. That means confronting history, not rewriting it. That means funding schools, not starving them. That means respecting teachers, not treating them as pawns in your campaign speeches. And that means ensuring every child, no matter their zip code, no matter their skin color, no matter the language they speak at home, every child has a chance to rise." The room erupted again, this time with a mixture of cheers and applause. Youngkin tried to wave it off, forcing a chuckle as though unimpressed, but the red creeping up his neck betrayed him. Crockett wasn't finished. "You say you want to put parents first," she said, her eyes locked on him now. "But let's tell the truth. What you've done is put politics first. You've told parents that their children are under attack, when the real attack is underfunded classrooms, overworked teachers, and kids who never see their own stories reflected in the books you've banned." The applause grew louder, rolling like thunder. Youngkin shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clutching his notes but no longer daring to glance down. "And let's be clear about who pays the price for your games," Crockett went on. Her voice softened, but the words landed heavier. "It's the little girl who walks into school every morning wondering why she's invisible in the lessons. It's the little boy who doesn't see anyone like him in the textbooks. It's the immigrants, child translating for his parents at night while trying to memorize facts from a curriculum that erases his own family's journey. Those kids deserve more than slogans. They deserve justice." The crowd fell silent, stunned, listening, hanging on every syllable. Youngkin swallowed hard, forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Crockett leaned in once more. "Governor, you built your argument on fear. I built mine on hope. And hope, no matter how you try to bury it, always grows stronger than fear." That line detonated like an explosion. The audience leapt to their feet, cheers echoing off the walls, claps reverberating like thunder. Cameras zoomed in on Youngkin, his expression hollow, a man realizing that the ground had shifted beneath him. She waited, letting the noise crest and settle before landing the final blow. "So let me thank you tonight. Because every time you dismiss us, every time you underestimate us, every time you try to silence us, you remind us why we fight. And Governor, I promise you this. You will not silence me, and you will not silence the millions of children and families whose futures are at stake." The chamber shook with applause. Youngkin, visibly rattled, shuffled his notes but found no refuge in the pages. The confidence that once seemed unshakable now looked paper-thin. He forced another laugh, but it cracked in his throat, drowned out by the roar of approval cascading toward Crockett. In that moment, the debate was over. Not because the moderator said so, not because the clock ran out, but because Jasmine Crockett had dismantled every pillar of his argument and replaced them with something stronger, truth spoken with unflinching dignity. By the time she finished, even Youngkin's allies were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The moment the debate ended, the ripple effect was immediate. Clips of Crockett's takedown hit the internet before the lights even dimmed in the auditorium. Within minutes, hashtags surged to the top of Twitter's trending list. Hashtag Crockett crushes, hashtag mic drop moment, hashtag education for all. One short clip, her line about hope growing stronger than fear, racked up hundreds of thousands of views in less than an hour. By dawn the next day, it had been seen by millions. News outlets scrambled to replay the exchange. Morning shows framed it as the moment of the night. Panelists on cable networks leaned forward in their chairs, dissecting Youngkin's stumbles and marveling at Crockett's composure. On late-night comedy shows, Youngkin's nervous chuckle became the butt of monologues, while Crockett's hand raise, the quiet gesture that silenced his interruptions, was replayed with admiration, often met with applause from studio audiences. But the most powerful validation came from ordinary people. Parents posted videos of themselves reacting to the debate. Teachers shared emotional posts, saying they finally felt seen. Immigrant families spoke about how their children had watched Crockett and felt, for the first time, that someone was speaking directly to them. One viral tweet read, "My daughter asked me why her history book doesn't mention people who look like her. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett gave her the answer and the hope that things can change." Even celebrities chimed in. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted a clip of Crockett's closing line with the caption, "This is leadership. Period." A famous actor reposted the same moment on Instagram, adding, "America needs more of this energy in politics." The swell of voices transformed the debate from a regional event into a national spectacle. For Youngkin, the shockwaves were brutal. Conservative commentators tried to spin the night as a minor stumble, but the footage told a different story. The smugness, the faltering words, the uneasy laugh, it all became meme fodder. TikTok flooded with remixes of Crockett's takedown. Teenagers stitched videos of her speech with their own reactions, some parodying Youngkin's fidgeting, others simply cheering her on. The governor, who once prided himself on projecting control, was suddenly the internet's punchline. But what made the aftermath extraordinary was not just the humiliation of one politician. It was the sense of collective triumph among those who had long felt unheard. Communities that had been dismissed in policy debates saw Crockett as a vessel for their frustration and their hope. Teachers who had been vilified for teaching honestly now had a viral moment to rally behind. Students who had been told their identities were distractions saw them reframed as sources of strength. The debate was over, but the movement it sparked was only beginning. Parents organized watch parties to replay the exchange. Advocacy groups launched petitions, using Crockett's words as rallying cries. Even international outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of American politics at its most raw and revealing. The resonance of the moment made clear that it was about far more than one stage, one night, or one opponent. It was about the kind of country people wanted their children to inherit. But the true impact of that moment wasn't just in the memes. It was in the lesson America took away. What lingered after the applause faded, after the memes were shared into a moment. Headlines printed was not just the image of a rattled governor or a triumphant congresswoman. It was the clarity of the lesson that Jasmine Crockett had forced into the national conversation. Education is not about fear, and it is not about control. It is about dignity. It is about fairness. It is about preparing every child from every background to believe they belong in the story of America. Crockett reframed the entire clash not as a personal victory, but as a collective affirmation. She reminded the country that the fight over schools was never simply about textbooks or tests. It was about identity, about whether children would grow up believing they are invisible or invaluable. Her calm dismantling of Youngkin's narrative exposed the hollowness of politics built on division. What remained standing was the unshakable truth that communities thrive when their children are empowered, not diminished. And in that sense, Crockett's mic drop moment became more than political theater. It became a parable about the power of courage. For immigrant families watching, it was validation that their children's stories matter. For parents struggling to trust a system that often fails them, it was proof that there are leaders willing to fight on their behalf. For teachers worn down by relentless criticism, it was a rare public defense of their dignity. The moral clarity of her message was simple yet profound. Fear will always try to shrink the circle of belonging, but hope expands it. Nostalgia may try to chain us to the past, but dignity calls us forward. And though politicians may rise and fall, the measure of a nation's greatness is not found in how it protects privilege, but in how it nurtures potential. The debate may have ended with Crockett's words echoing in that chamber, but the resonance carried far beyond. Viewers felt it not just as entertainment, but as inspiration. They replayed her lines not just to laugh at Youngkin's stumble, but to remind themselves of what is possible when truth is spoken with conviction. And perhaps that is why this moment matters so deeply. It was not just about Glenn Youngkin or Jasmine Crockett. It was about the audience watching at home, the parents searching for hope, the children daring to dream, the citizens deciding what kind of America they want to inherit. Because in the end, this wasn't about Youngkin or Crockett. It was about us. The night Glenn Youngkin tried to corner Jasmine Crockett will be remembered not for his challenge, but for her calm, devastating response. What began as a clash of talking points became a defining moment of truth, a reminder that dignity can stand taller than arrogance, that preparation can outlast posturing, and that hope will always echo louder than fear. Crockett's takedown was not just a victory for her, it was a victory for every teacher, every parent, every child who has ever wondered if their story matters in America's classrooms. But the lesson cannot end on that stage. The real power of this moment lies in what we do with it. Do we share it, spread it, carry it into conversations with friends and neighbors? Do we take it as proof that leaders who speak for all of us can rise, even when facing the loudest voices of division? Or do we let it fade? Just another viral clip lost to the scroll of history. The choice is ours. If you believe in what Jasmine Crockett stood for that night, if you believe in education that includes every child, in leaders who fight for dignity, in the courage to speak truth even when it shakes the room, then this is your moment too. So don't just watch. Don't just nod. Be part of this movement. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. Add your voice to the chorus of millions who are tired of fear winning the day. Because together we can ensure that what happened on that stage becomes more than a memory. It becomes a turning point. The fight for dignity in America's classrooms is far from over, and it needs you.